now for 11 years. And one of the things that I'm most pleased with is that out of the 50-some authors we've had, 2 people have said no to this. And I think it's something that is unique to what we're doing. I don't know of many groups that get a chance to talk to the author and hear what he has to say about the book. So our normal framework, we'll let John talk for about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to questions. Often the questions are really interesting and open up new areas of inquiry that, you know, nobody's really thought about. So we have John MacLean, and all of you obviously know who he is. And so I think we'll just go ahead. It's your turn, John.
Okay. Do you guys have a big, I can't see what you can see. Do you have a big screen there that you can look at?
Yes, you're on the screen.
Okay, because I've got a PowerPoint program, and I thought I'd run through that fairly quickly, because you guys you're all from Montana. Come on, we kind of know each other to begin with. So let me pop this thing up here. Can you see that?
No.
No.
No. You can't see it. Okay. Going back to no PowerPoint program. The book I'm going to talk a little bit about today is Home Waters, but it is one in a kind of a continuum of books that have gone on since my father started writing books. A River Runs Through It. Home Waters is correctly, I believe, described as a companion book to A River Runs Through It. I didn't write it. I didn't set up to do that. The way it became a book was I was fishing on the Blackfoot River on the Muchmore Hole with a friend of mine who owns a ranch that abuts onto the Muchmore. And I took a couple of practice casts at the head of the hole and tied into the biggest rainbow trout I've ever seen in the Blackfoot River, let alone battled. And it became quite a battle. My friend had one of those long-handled nets that you use on a boat, and he got downstream and started trying to net the fish that was pretty near the surface, and he couldn't get it into the net because it was too big. And he kept trying, and he was kind of hitting the fish with the net. And I thought, I was yelling at him. I said, stop doing that, because you're going to knock the fish off the line. So we worked on it for quite a while. And finally, the fish got tired enough that it stopped extricating itself from the net. And we got it inshore and took some quick photographs. And frankly, it looked like a salmon. I'm sorry I can't show you the PowerPoint, because it proves that it looked like a salmon. I have a picture of it. Great big head on the thing. And I don't think it was born in the Blackfoot. I think it was born in the Clark Fork. And after they got rid of that dam, the Blackfoot River was open once again for fish to migrate up from the Clark Fork River and spawn, and to come and live if they wished. And I think that this was one of them. The Clark Fork is a bigger river, bigger water, bigger fish. As I say, I was in my 70s when this happened, and I had never in my lifetime seen a rainbow that big on the Blackfoot. So I went and sat on the bank, and I had a long think about it. Realized that this was kind of a lifetime gig. And my friend said, would you mind writing this up for a little newsletter to my angler club in Chicago? He and I had become friends in Chicago. And I said, sure. So I did, and a friend of mine read that and said, why don't you do that for Big Sky magazine? They'll pay you. I said, oh, that's a good idea. And so I wrote it for Big Sky magazine and forgot about it, frankly. A couple of years later, an editor, absolutely wonderful, young editor from New York, was out vacationing in Livingston. And he picked up this battered 2-year-old copy of Big Sky magazine and read my story. And he called me up and he said, would you like to do a book on this? I said, well, frankly, no, I wouldn't. I said, I've been asked a lot of times, why don't you do a biography of your father? And I think that I said, I've had something really better left to others. But he said, well, it doesn't have to be that. He said, you know, you can write what you want. And we wound up doing it. That's Home Waters. It was a deeply gratifying experience, and I see there's a lot of white hair in the audience, and I think some of you probably have done something like the same thing, which is when we get older, you take a halt, and you stop, and you turn your chair around and look back, and start recovering things that you haven't thought about in 30 or 40 or 50 years. And it makes your life more complete. I mean, and if you write it down, even if you don't get it published by Mariner Classics with a fancy New York editor who helps you, you've left something for your future generations, and they will thank you for it, believe me. I had to do an awful lot of research for the book, and there was nothing except a river runs through it. That was a chronicle of the family. I had to pick it up in bits and pieces here and there. I got a lot of wonderful help from people. One retired University of Montana professor has made a retirement project out of going back through all the publications in Missoula, back into the 19-teens and 20s and so on, finding out stuff about the MacLean family. And it's now a huge conglomeration of stuff that's available at the University of Montana, but it just came out in parts while I was doing Home Waters. Okay, I got to the end of the book and looked at it, and I thought, well, you know, I've taken some chances in here. In some ways, it's a fish story. But it's a story about my family, it's a story about the river, but it's also a story about a place, about a region, the Blackfoot Valley and the Swan Valley and the Clearwater Valley, where my family spent their years and where we still have a cabin. The cabin is in its centennial, a kind of a rolling centennial anniversary. The lease on the cabin on Seeley Lake was taken out in 1921. Didn't start building until the next year, and it took several years to build that cabin. So 2023 is 100 years, and so will 2024 be 100 years for the cabin. We just keep celebrating this thing. It's still used. It's a log cabin. We have an historic project underway to restore what is supposed to be the last standing ice house in our region. We have an old ice house where ice was stored during the winter, and we would use it in the summer before we had electricity. And it's been kind of falling down. We're trying to get grants to get that restored. So the cabin is still there, and that's nice. But one of the big chances I took with the book was a long chapter, if you looked in it, about the journey by Lewis and a small party on the return of the Corps of Exploration when they went through the Blackfoot Valley along the river of the road to the Buffalo. There was an interstate highway established there by indigenous peoples for perhaps millennia, certainly for many hundreds of years, where the tribes who were west of the Continental Divide would cross the divide and go out on the plains to hunt the buffalo regularly twice a year. They went in the winter, I've discovered, as well as in the summer. And they wore down a trail, and they used the Blackfoot River as a guidon. And the trail generally follows the Blackfoot. If you drive, as many of you have, if not all of you, Route 200 going from Missoula to Helena, you are following much of the old road to the Buffalo, but not all of it. And what I discovered when I was doing work on the book was that there are parts of that road that are not acknowledged by historians, that are not well known, that still exist, where you can identify them and stand where they stood. They're fairly easy to identify once you get there. They're not as wide as a truck. They're not farmer truck roads. They're not narrow like game trails. They're just the right width for a travel and a broad horse trail. And I wrote a whole chapter about this because in exploring it, I discovered parts of the Blackfoot Valley discovered before. Got an overview of it. I mean, we always went to the river, and everything we did was centered on the Blackfoot River. But if you get up in those hills a lot and look around and follow this trail, you get a very different view of the Blackfoot Valley. It's one of the best preserved in the state of Montana. Local people have banded together to do that and to keep as much development out of there as they can, and it has worked. So there I took a chance. And I took a lot of chances with it. I was really kind of worried about it because I talked about my family, and that isn't what I do. You know, I spent 30 years in the newspaper business. I spent 25 years writing nonfiction narratives about wildland fires, and all of a sudden I'm disclosing a part of myself that was very precious to me, and I worried that it would be attacked as having been a caboose to my father's engine. And that hasn't happened, I'm happy to say. The book is seen as a standalone, capable of standing on its own, but it is very clearly a follow-on from A River Runs Through It, and in a lot of ways very deliberate. I mean, I lived that life. I know what it was like when my dad was not writing for most of his career. I know what it was like when he wrote A River Runs Through It. I know what it meant to him. Sometimes people, I don't think you'll be shocked, but I think sometimes people are shocked to learn that was the first book he ever published, and it didn't come out until he was 73 years old. It took him that long to wrap himself around the story of his brother Paul, who is the central character in A River Runs Through It, and Susan's a very important character in Home Waters. One of the other things I did in Home Waters was to describe the facts of Paul's murder. It has become kind of mythical. It was mythical in my father's telling. He invented stories about it to try to ease his way into it and try to make something comprehensible about what was a harsh and in many ways without any depth to it, just a bungled robbery or a fight that went bad. And he tried to turn it into something bigger than that, a conflict between Paul and an Irish mafia. I don't think that that was the case in terms of his murder. I think that Paul was in debt to an Irish mafia, and serious debt. But when you look at the exact circumstances of that murder, they tend to explain themselves. And my mother, who was the realist in the family, said basically she thought Paul went looking for trouble and found more than he could handle. And I think that that's an unpleasant but realistic conclusion. But Paul's story is not concluded, ever. Paul's story lives on, and it has had some very positive effects. I talk to people regularly who have a brother or a sister or someone they love deeply that they try to help and who need it and who will not accept it. And this is very hurtful, to offer the best of yourself, your love, your help to someone who is very important to you, and to have them turn and walk away. A River Runs Through It is a source of consolation for these people. They see that it is possible to have a compassionate and loving portrait of someone like that, in this case, Paul. Paul was very important to me in my life, although he was killed before I was born. I was supposed to be Paul, and originally my dad was going to name me for Paul. God, my mother thankfully stopped that, and I'm named for both my grandfathers, which makes me very happy. But Paul was always there. He was always a presence, and I talk about that in the book, an unavoidable presence. And I think that having a realistic account of him and his death does not diminish him. It just makes him, to me, more real. That's my thing. I was a journalist, and I write nonfiction and try to keep the facts reasonably straight. So the book came out, and it's done very well. And one of the really nice things that it's done is to have an afterlife in both conservation circles and in Montana. The Library of Congress sponsored a program to teach students how to match place and literature, how to derive a sense of place from literature and also from their own surroundings. And I sponsored 10 projects last year in Montana by museums and schools and others to do little projects. Vando, the school kids went out and the community went out and they dug up a history of Ovando. In other places, they did other things. The Museum of Mountain Flying did a project where they tried to match fishing and flying. They had an event at the end with a bunch of kids where they went out on the Blackfoot River and tried to catch a fish, and like many before them, including on occasion the MacLeans, the kids got skunked, except for one kid who caught one fish at the end. But it was generally a big success with all those projects. That was a lot of fun. It's also given me a voice in conservation circles that I did not have before, and I have used it. The Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act is still pending before the United States Congress. Senator Daines is still holding it up. There was a hearing on it last fall where for the first time there was a reading on it in the committee, and Daines promised to meet with Senator Tester and come to a conclusion, a compromise conclusion. What he would like to do is to remove the acres that are in wilderness study from that status and move them back into general use. But he is not, I don't think he's negotiated in good faith, to be honest. He said he would. He said it was going to be a success. And apparently, in the first time they met, they just went back to a maximalist position. There's a compromise there to be made. There are acres in that wilderness study that have been declared unfit for wilderness. So why not take them out? But I've written about that. I wrote about it in the Washington Post in an op-ed, and wrote very specifically identifying Senator Daines as the holdup on this. That's one thing, but I've come up with more things as time has gone on, and I do speak out. My father said that it is the privilege of old age to speak for the land, and I have found a way to do that thanks to him, thanks to A River Runs Through It, and thanks to my follow-up with Home Waters. One of the interesting little tidbits in Home Waters is a discussion of Ernest Hemingway's story, Big Two-Hearted River. I think it's the best story he ever wrote, but that's debatable. It's a fishing story. I think most of you are familiar with it. It's about a solo trip taken by Hemingway's alter ego, Nick Adams, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where he goes off and goes fishing. There's no plot to it. There's no dialogue. There are 3 instances of inner dialogue by Nick that are very short. it is almost hallucinatory in its creation of place. It's like a nightmare dream, a fever dream. I mean, something really bad is going on with this guy. He's trying to get over something, and you never learn what it is. Well, my dad and I read that story, and I was very young, like about 13, 14 years old, and we tried to analyze it and tried to figure out what's eating this guy. And the best we could come up with is from the Nick Adams stories that he'd had a couple of failed love affairs right around the same time. But that seemed very unsatisfactory. And the main message we took from that, and it was very important to both of us in our writing, was that fishing can be made into literature. And my dad pursued that. Big Two-Hearted River and Hemingway are core of what happens with language in A River Runs Through It. The lead in my family, There Was No Clear Line Between Religion and Fly Fishing, would not have been written that way without Hemingway. I was very influenced by Hemingway. You need to get into Hemingway and then you need to get out of him, because his rhythms and his cadences and his language and his mannerisms are so identifiable that you don't want to just be a Hemingway imitator. That's a legion. Now, you've got to find your own voice. Anyway, I got a call from the community library in Ketchum, Idaho, saying, we read your book and would you like to give a talk like this one to the community library? We are the custodians of the Ernest and Mary Hemingway House here in Ketchum. I said, I'd love to. I thought, well, I better do something about Hemingway if I'm going to do that. So after 50 years or more of not having read Hemingway, I went back and read Big Two-Hearted River and fell in love with it again and got very excited about it because I discovered that my dad and I had blown it. We had missed it. It isn't about a couple of busted love affairs. We were right about that. It is about a boy wounded by the war, literally and figuratively, just as Hemingway was. You know, Hemingway was nearly killed in World War I, a couple of weeks after he got there for the Red Cross. He took 247 pieces of shrapnel in his legs from a mine explosion and was only saved because there was another man standing in front of him who was killed. And there's been this big argument over the last 50 years about what's the background of Big Two-Hearted River. And you can resolve it in the end by saying that it is about a boy recovering from the war, and it is the restoration of the human spirit by fishing. And that's what it's all about. So, fine. I told this story to my editor, and he said, well, why don't we do something with this? He said, when was Big Two-Hearted River published? I said, 1925. He said, well, let's do a centennial edition. So we did. And it's coming out on May 9th, and it's beautiful. There's a continuum in it among A River Runs Through It, Home Waters, and the Centennial Edition, which is the use of original wood engravings. There are beautiful wood engravings in the first edition, but not the later ones of A River Runs Through It. Based on that, I asked if we could have wood engravings in Home Waters, and if you'll open it, you'll see that there are a dozen of them. Those are original made for the book. It's not an inexpensive process, by the way. And we've done it again with Big Two-Hearted River. We have a dozen original wood engravings going in there, and it ties the three of them together very nicely. So I'm waiting to see how this goes. I wrote a foreword for the centennial, and I became obsessed with the story over the last year. I wound up going to the JFK Library in Boston to look at the drafts, the handwritten drafts of Big Two-Hearted River. They have an enormous Hemingway collection. And then I went to Seney in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, which is where the trip took place, and looked for the places where Hemingway had fished. And lastly, I spent a week as writer in residence at the Hemingway House. And in each place, I learned something about it. You know, it's hard to learn anything new or get anything new about a story that's been around and been looked at by everybody who's a Hemingway scholar for 100 years. But I did. I got some stuff. I found a map, and I think I'm the first ever to use it, made by a guy who lived in Seney at the time, 1919, when the actual trip took place, pointing out what the scene was like in terms of where were burned, and there was a hotel that was burned that was in an early draft of the story. He had a correspondence with another researcher talking about what he knew about where Hemingway might have fished. And Hemingway was actually Hemingway and two friends. And they clearly didn't fish the Fox River, which runs through Seney. They fished to the north of that. And then I found a postcard, which just came into public hands in a library in 2006, from Hemingway to his father at the end of that trip in 1919 with a Seney postmark on it. And everybody has assumed that that trip was in September of 1919. The postcard is marked August 27th, 1919, says where he was fishing, 10 miles north, and gives how long they fished, you know. So you now have exact dates and pretty much an exact place, which wasn't all certain before. Anyway, it's been a lot of fun, and we'll see if how it goes. The early indications are that there's actually a first review that's been written, and it's a very good one. So that's my 25 minutes, and I will be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you, John. Do we have? We must have some questions. You're gonna have to speak up. Go ahead. You have something?
No, not at all. Sorry. How old are you? How's that for, no. Kidding.
Actually, the only question I had, I just enjoyed your books. We lived in Sealy Lake for about 20 years, and I always like to read by authors from that area, from areas where I live. And so, having been able to fish the rivers there, you know, your book spoke to me very well, representing that area of the country. And,
Did you hear that?
No, I did not. If you could repeat it.
He just said that he lived in Sealy Lake for a while and he really enjoyed reading something by an author who was in Sealy Lake. Somebody else? Yeah, go ahead.
On page 189,
Page 189.
All right, it's going to be like that.
about 2/3 of the way down the page, you say that when you got around to asking your father what the "it" in the
Yes.
title of a river runs through it, why that word, he answered simply, quote, "It's the way a farmer might describe a river in one of his fields." Would you expand on that a little? I can't get my head around why your father answered that way.
Well, you have to remember he was William Ramey Harper Professor of English at the University of Chicago and won the Quantrell Award for being the greatest teacher of the year more often than any teacher in the history of the University of Chicago. And for amusement, he listened to the livestock prices on the radio. Now, he was a man who never forgot where he came from. He was happy to do what he did. It made him, the University of Chicago was the correct place for him. But he was, to the core, Montana and outdoors, and a believer in people who still lived out where you are and worked the soil, ran the railroads, drove the nails, cut the trees, and so on. So he said, it's something a farmer might look down and say, what does he say about his field? Well, just a river runs through it. That's what a farmer would say, and it's laconic and dry, and it's Norman. And it took me a while to wrap my head around it. I thought you made a mistake. But it has become embedded in the language, not only in the United States, but I get examples of it abroad all the time. You know, something or another runs through it, or this runs through it. You know, it's just a universal phrase, the way a lot of Shakespeare is picked up. Fooled me.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess this is sort of a fan question about about Young Men in Fire, and I believe you edited his manuscript, or?
I get blamed for that a lot, but it's, let me explain how that happened. My father worked on Young Men on Fire for 13 or 14 years, and the last years were not good ones, and he was just looking at it with a pencil in his hand. So that it was, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, I lost your visual. So if you can hear me, when he died, we looked at the manuscript, and we had people read it, and it was difficult. It was there, but it was chaotic. And two things happened. My sister Jean and I made the decision to take it to the University of Chicago Press, which had published River Runs Through It, and not to try it anywhere else. And we took it there, and a very fine young editor by the name of Alan Thomas became the editor of it. And he looked at it and he said, well, John, you know, you have to realize that books sometimes come in this way. It's difficult, there's confusion in it about where things are. But this is not something that has never happened in the publishing industry before. So he took it to Japan. His wife was a Japan scholar, and he accompanied her to Japan where he didn't speak the language. And so he had nothing to do but sit in his hotel room for 6 weeks and reorder things in the book. And when I talked to him about it afterward, I said, did you do any rewriting? He said, yes. He said, I rewrote one transition where you had to have a transition there. It's only a couple of sentences. So, well, Alan, what I want you to do is sit down and write a note about the editing on this, because you and I both know we're going to get blamed for having rewritten my dad's book for him. He said, all right, but your job is to do fact checking on it. So I took the draft that he had arranged, and I was actually at Seeley Lake at the time. I did it at the main table in the main room. And I went over that and over it, and I turned in about 100 suggested fixes. And all the way from things that might be capitalized to things that were where I had a factual dispute. And my sister did the same thing, and she turned in about 60. And the press, knowing that there is a certain amount of rivalry between me and my sister, kept score on whose fixes were used and whose weren't. And I got an over 90% rating, and I'm very proud of that. But that's what I did. I did not rewrite the bloody book. I did, and that isn't really editing. That's fact checking. That's advanced fact checking. So there you have it. Everybody thinks that that we rewrote Norman's book for him. Move forward a little bit, a year or two. We did the audio tape for Young Men on Fire. I did the first reading for that. I read the book. And I did it at the cabin. And there's one point there where they couldn't edit out the squirrels. So, they tried to, but there's squirrels in the background at one point. And I'm reading through this thing, and it's about the easiest job I've ever had in my life. That stuff, try reading it out loud. It just falls out of your mouth. Until I got to one spot, a transition, where it went clunk, 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 and then moved right back into this smooth stuff. And I got done at the end of the day and I said, that was Alan Thomas. That's the transition he wrote. I know where it is. And I was right. So that's the only place in that book that was actually rewritten. And the rest of it was arranged and made into a narrative. Thank you for giving me the chance to say that again. Try to get that word out.
Somebody else? Go ahead.
John, have you had a chance to do any writing on the 1988 Yellowstone fires?
No, I know a lot of people who fought that fire, but I have not. My writing about fires, I've written 5 books on fires, and they're all the same theme, which is multiple fatality wildland fires where a lot of firefighters are killed. And that didn't happen on the Yellowstone fires. Yellowstone fires were significant in themselves, but they're not, in the history of fires, they're just, it's the Yellowstone that's burning. Well, Yellowstone does that every 200 years. It's a lodgepole forest, a high wet pole. The normal lifespan of a lodgepole is 75 to 125 years, but when you go high like that in elevation and get wet and so on, you extend the fire regime to about 200 years. And that is a stand replacement event. And it happened to be in the park that we all love. And a lot of people became hysterical when it happened. The jewel in the crown of the National Park Service is burning to the ground, and you dumb people in yellow Nomex and green pants are letting it happen. That was Alan Simpson, the senator from Wyoming. And he later apologized for all that once somebody explained to him how these things work. I've never written about it, but I've been there. I spent some time there with the guy who's assistant fire management officer for Yellowstone. And he was brought in after the fires to prevent a broadcast fire from happening again. And the way you do that is you punch holes in the forest. You clear 10-acre clearings, and you clear stuff out, and you knock down trees. He's a very aggressive ex-smoke jumper guy, and that's why they brought him in. And he couldn't make it happen because the people in the park would say, well, come and see us in 200 years. That's when we're going to have another fire. You're not going to be knocking down any trees. That mentality, and it's a very dangerous mentality, especially when scientists have that mentality, that you can't go around knocking down trees. Because what is needed now in fire to do anything to prevent the kind of catastrophes that we're having every 3rd or 4th year is to have more fire in a prescribed and relatively controlled manner beforehand to remove fiber that is hypercombustible. If you don't believe that, go to Seeley Lake and drive along Boy Scout Road, stop right about at the Seeley Lake campground, which is, my cabin's the first one up from that, and then instead of walking toward the lake, walk up a little hill, and you'll go through a cleared area where there are beautiful western larch, and they are growing again, an inch a year or so. And then get about 150 yards up from that, where the prescribed clearing stopped. And you can hardly get a spider through what's beyond that. It's so overgrown and dense and dirty and unavailable for wildlife. We need more fire, not less. And I think that is, I don't think it's a message from Yellowstone is its own event. Yellowstone is its own thing. It's one of the most wonderful things in the world. And it did burn, and it was kind of awful. But that's what happens. I mean, that's nature taking care of itself. When Lewis and Clark went across the Louisiana Purchase, they saw clouds of smoke all the time. You know, it happens. It's healthy. What's happening now is not healthy. And I have been saying that for 25 years. And the two big differences now compared to what went on in the 50s and 60s and so on is the expansion of the wildland-urban interface, more people living in previously wild lands, and climate change. You put those two together and you have exactly what's happening. Things like Paradise in California, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people being killed in forests where they insist on living. And, you know, some people in Paradise were retired smoke jumpers. You know, they don't have a lot of money. They want to live in the woods. So there they are out there in a combustible area that has not been primed for fire prevention because it's very expensive. I'm sorry, I can go on like that forever. You asked me what time it was, and I told you how to make a watch.
Are there anybody else? Yeah.
Could you tell us a personal story about a family that approached you to write about another forest fire?
Could somebody repeat that question, because I didn't know.
Can you tell her about another family that approached you to write about a fire?
Oh, well, that happened a lot after my first book, Fire on the Mountain, which was about the South Canyon fire. And I was seen as the champion of Don Mackey and the people who were killed. And so when there were subsequent fires, the 30 Mile fire being one, for example, in Washington State, where firefighters were killed and then were more or less blamed for their own deaths. The families, in that case, one person in particular called me up and said, "This isn't true. You know, our kids weren't irresponsible and negligent. Would you come and look at it?" And that, as I say, that happened a lot. And I'll give you that as one example. And I would go and look at these fires. And sometimes I would not write a book about them because I didn't feel that the reports were wrong. In the case of the 30 Mile fire, I did feel that the reports were wrong. And I wrote a book called The 30 Mile Fire. And everybody now agrees that that was a completely botched fire investigation. South Canyon, which was a huge one in 1994, you know, 14 people killed, they didn't even have tape recorders. People would make notes of interviews and then they couldn't read their notes. One interview with a key witness was done weeks after he'd gotten home. The brother-in-law of Don Mackey, who was the supervisor. And this guy, Kevin Erickson, was interviewed by telephone, sitting in his bedroom. And there were several people on the other end of the line. I mean, he couldn't see them. They were just asking these questions. He doesn't know if it's being recorded. And the whole thing was botched. And it got him in terrible trouble with his family because it sounded like he was dumping on Don. And he wasn't. And it took a book, among other things, to straighten that out, that particular thing. And there were lots of things like that. They don't always make mistakes, and right now the Fire Lab in Missoula is working very hard to come up with a new protocol for fire investigations. And I have done my thing with them. I spent a lot of years working with a partner on the Yarnell Hill fire, and the partnership didn't work, and so I'm not going to do a book. But I know a lot about it. And I did a long analysis on a video for the Fire Lab of the similarities and differences between decision making on the South Canyon fire and the Yarnell Hill fire. Both of them very multiple fatality fires, 14 on South Canyon, 19 on Yarnell Hill. And they're going to use that and a lot of other things to try to do a better job of these fire investigations. They're already doing a much better job. And we've talked about how you do this. And I said, look, first of all, you've got to make something in the way of a recording of it, however you want to do that, technically. And when you've done with the recording, you need to take it back to the person you interviewed and say, this is our understanding of what you said. Have we understood you? Are we correct about this? Before you go into concrete on this thing, because these are not professional actors. They're not people who are used to public speaking. And I'm talking about the investigators as well as the firefighters. You've got to have an agreed understanding of what was said as a start. And what they said was, well, we realize that. We've already figured that out, which they had. They figured a lot of stuff out on their own because they're intelligent, well-intentioned people. So, well, what we're going to do is when we have a conflict, we're going to say, here is what one person said and here is what another analysis is, and let people decide. I said, you can't do that. You are the official fire investigators. I realize that you don't have, like the National Transportation Safety Board, you don't have a cadre of people who are full-time investigators. You can't afford that. These things, thank God, don't happen that often to have a standing body to investigate them. But you are the official party here. You must take a stand. You must say, this is our synthesis. Here is the thesis. This person says this. Here is the antithesis, the antithesis. This person says something different. Here is what we believe. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. And if you're right, you're right. But you can't avoid that position of responsibility. So we'll see if I win on that one. I don't know. I mean, this is a fluid situation. That video is now being final edited, and they're going to use it in training, and I'm going to have permission to use it myself. And I get invited to do things still, although I haven't written about fire in quite a while. And we'll see where we go with that. I hope we go somewhere useful.
Okay, anybody else? Well, thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it. This is always, as I said, the highlight of each book, to be able to talk to them. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Okay, I'm going to sign off.
Okay, thank you. The next book, which will be available 1st of August, thank you, is a novel, a coming-of-age novel. The book will be available the 1st of April. Everybody knows the routine. And the discussions will be the first week in May. There will not be a public lecture on this book, unfortunately. Thank you all again.
Thank you.